Hello guys, welcome to my channel. In this video I'll be talking to you about the import and export of Sudan. I've been talking about a series on Sudan, like I talked about a general history of Sudan and I talked about football in Sudan. This time I'll be talking to you about the importation and exports in Sudan. Now, the economy of Sudan has boomed on the back of increases in oil production, high oil prices, and large inflows of foreign direct investments until the second half of 2002. GDP growth registered more than 10% per year in 2006 and 2007. From 1997 to date, Sudan has been working with the International Monetary Fund (IMF) to implement macroeconomic reforms, including a managed float of the exchange rate. Sudan began exporting crude oil in the last quarter of 1999. As at 2019, Sudan had an estimated GDP of $30.873 billion and a GDP rank of 98 overall. They had a GDP per capita of $714 as at 2019. As at 2017, the export of Sudan was placed at $4.1 billion, and the goods that they exported were gold, oil and petroleum products, cotton, livestock, peanuts, gum arabic and sugar. The main export partners of Sudan were United Arab Emirates, China, Saudi Arabia, India, Egypt, Netherlands, Indonesia, Turkey, South Korea, France. The imports of Sudan as at 2017 was estimated as $8.22 billion, and the import goods were foodstuffs, manufactured goods, refinery and transport equipment, medicines, chemicals, textiles, and wheat. The main import partners of Sudan were China, India, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Pakistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Germany, South Korea, and Thailand. Agricultural production remains important because it employs 80% of the workforce and contributes a third of the GDP of Sudan. The war in Darfur, the aftermath of 2 decades of war in the Second Sudanese Civil War from 1983 to 2005 in the south, the lack of basic infrastructure in large areas, and a reliance by much of the population on subsistence agriculture ensure much of the population will remain at or below the poverty line for years. The problem remains, despite rapid rises in average per capita income. In January 2007, the government introduced a new currency, the Sudanese pound, at an initial exchange rate of $1 equals 2 Sudanese pounds. Now let's talk about the history of import and export in Sudan. The current GDP per capita of Sudan grew 46% in the 1960s, reaching a peak growth of 170% in the 1970s. But this proved unsustainable, and growth consequently scaled back to 34% in the 1980s. Finally, it shrank by 26% in the 1990s. Until the early 1970s, Sudan's agricultural output was mostly dedicated to internal consumption. In 1972, the Sudanese government became more pro-Western and made plans to export food and cash crops. However, commodity prices declined throughout the 1970s, causing economic problems for Sudan. At the same time, debt servicing costs from the money spent mechanizing agriculture rose. In 1978, the International Monetary Fund (IMF) negotiated a Structural Adjustment Program (SAP) with the government. This further promoted the mechanized export agriculture sector. This caused great economic problems for the pastoralists of Sudan. During the late 1970s and 1980s, the IMF, World Bank, and key donors worked closely to promote reforms to counter the effect of inefficient economic policies and practices in Sudan. By 1984, a combination of factors including drought, inflation, and confused application of Islamic law reduced donor disbursements and capital flight led to a serious foreign exchange crisis and increased shortages of imported inputs and commodities. More significantly, the 1989 revolution caused many donors in Europe, the US, and Canada to suspend official development assistance, but not humanitarian aid. However, as Sudan became the world's largest debtor to the World Bank and International Monetary Fund by 1993, its relationship with the international financial institutions soared in the mid-1990s and has yet to be fully rehabilitated. The government fell out of compliance with an IMF standby program and accumulated substantial arrearages on repurchase obligations. A 4-year economic reform plan was announced in 1988 but was not pursued. An economic reform plan was announced in 1989 and began implementation a 3-year economic restructuring program designed to reduce the public sector deficit, end subsidies, private state enterprises, and encourage new foreign and domestic investments. In 1993, the IMF suspended Sudan's voting rights, and the World Bank suspended Sudan's right to make withdrawals under effective and fully disbursed loans and credits. Loan funds and EU agricultural credits totaling more than €1 billion were also suspended. So now let's talk about some of the sectors in Sudan's imports and exports. Number one, we're talking about agriculture. Now, the primary resources, including cotton, peanuts, gum arabic, and sesame seeds, are part of the agricultural resources that are involved in the import and export of Sudan. Although the country is trying to diversify its cash crops, cotton and peanuts remain its major agricultural exports. Grain sorghum, which they call dura, is the principal food crop, and wheat is grown for domestic consumption. Sesame seeds and peanuts are cultivated for domestic consumption and increasingly for export. 3 main agricultural subsectors are active in Sudan. We have the pastoral livestock, cropping, and fish production. Now, livestock production has vast potential, and many animals, particularly cows, sheep, and camels, are exported to Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries. However, Sudan remains a net importer of food. Problems of investment finance, production, and transportation remain the greatest constraints to a more dynamic agricultural economy. A major problem, which has been growing for decades, is the continual loss of open lands previously used for animal grazing to mechanized dry lands and irrigated farming. Another sector is industry. Sudan's rapid industrial development consists of agricultural processing, electronics assembly, plastics manufacturing, furniture, tanning, sugar production, meat processing, and various light industries located in any of the 10 industrial areas in Khartoum, which is the capital city of Sudan, if you can remember from our previous videos. Due to the many countries depending on Sudan for medicines and medical services, Sudan is now concentrating on becoming a hub for the medical industry in East Africa, providing facilities and concessions for medical investments and succeeding in covering about 70% of needs and exporting to many neighboring nations. In recent years, the geared industrial complex in Al Jazeera state introduced the assembly of small autos and trucks and some heavy military equipment, such as armored personnel carriers and the Bashir and Zubair main battle tanks, as well as handguns, light and heavy machine guns, and howitzers, and recently drone production. Sudan is reputed to have great mineral resources, and exploration has started extensively for gold, of which is produced nearly 30 tons annually, providing a great boost to the foreign exchange reserves of the nation, with the participation of many investment companies from all over the world. Now, quantities of asbestos, chromium, mica, kaolin, and copper are now exploited commercially, especially for exports to China. Now, another sector is petroleum. Extensive petroleum exploration first began in Sudan in the mid-1970s. Significant finds were made in the Upper Nile region, and commercial quantities of oil began to be exported in October 2000, reducing Sudan's outflow of foreign exchange for imported petroleum products. Today, oil is an important export industry in Sudan. Estimates suggest that oil accounts for about 70% and 90% of Sudan's total exports. The primary importers of Sudanese oil are Japan, China, South Korea, Indonesia, and India. Most of Sudan's oil reserves are located in the Muglad and Melut Rift basins in the south of the country. Crude oil from Muglad Basin is known as Nile Blend and is refined at the Khartoum Crude Oil Refinery. In 2006, the China National Petroleum Corporation upgraded the Khartoum refinery, doubling its capacity to 100,000 barrels per day. Now let's move to the next sector, which is mining. The mining industry contributed little to GDP until discovery of commercially exploitable quantities of petroleum in the late 1970s offered hope that the sector would play an increased role in the economy in the future. Non-hydrocarbon minerals of actual or potential commercial value include gold, chrome, copper, iron ore, manganese, asbestos, gypsum, mica, limestone, marble, uranium, silver, lead, tungsten, zinc, and diamonds. Now, some of the basic infrastructure in Sudan that aids the import and export, we have, for example, transport and energy. Now, Sudan has 4,725 kilometers of narrow gauge single track railroads that serve the northern and central portions of the country. The main line runs from Wadi Alpha on the Egyptian border to Khartoum and southwest to Al Ubaid via Sunar and Kusti, with extensions to Inyala in the southern Darfur and Wau in Bahr al-Ghazal. Now, the chief sources of energy in Sudan in 2010 were wood, charcoal, hydroelectric power, and oil. Today, Sudan is seeking to expand its installed capacity of electricity generation of around 300 megawatts, of which 180 megawatts is hydroelectric and the rest is thermal. European investors, considering the continuing US economic, trade, and financial sanctions regime, are the most likely providers of technology for this purpose. More than 70% of Sudan's hydropower comes from the Roseris Dam on the Blue Nile grid. Various projects are proposed to expand the hydropower, thermal generation, and other sources of energy. But so far, the government has had difficulty arranging sufficient financing. A new dam which is being established in Merowe, which has been opened in 2008 and generates 125 megawatts of electricity. Now, let's talk about the trade, sanctions, and foreign aid in Sudan. On November 3, 1997, the US government imposed a trade embargo against Sudan and a total asset freeze against the government of Sudan under Executive Order 13067. The US believed the government of Sudan gave support to international terrorism, destabilized neighboring governments, and permitted human rights violations. The consequence of the embargo is that US corporations cannot invest in the Sudan oil industry, so companies in China, Malaysia, and India are the major investors. Now, historically, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other organizations of petroleum exporting countries, OPEC, nations traditionally have supplied most of the Sudan's economic assistance. Sudan's role as an economic link between Arab, African countries is reflected by the presence in Khartoum of the Arab Bank for African Development. The World Bank had been the largest source of development loans. So there we have it, guys. This is where I'll be stopping in this video. If you want to find out more about the imports and exports of Sudan, check out Wikipedia or other sites on Google. Thank you for watching this video and have a very nice day. Bless up.